When it comes to the greatest quarterback seasons in NFL history, there are many candidates for it. In 1984, Dan Marino, in only his sophomore campaign, threw 48 touchdowns in what was then by far the most prolific passing season in NFL history, culminating in a Super Bowl appearance against a much better 49ers team that the Dolphins lost to. Another candidate is 2007 Tom Brady, who threw for 50 touchdowns, the first to throw 50 for a high-powered Patriots offense that went undefeated in the regular season and were a defense stop away from going 19-0 overall. A third candidate is 2011 Aaron Rodgers, who threw for 45 touchdowns in 15 games and had a still record 122.5 passer rating for a Packers team that went 14-1 with him. Another candidate is 2018 Mahomes, who threw for 50 touchdowns and led a high-powered Chiefs offense to 12 wins despite an atrocious defense. Mahomes maintained that high level of play in the playoffs, but unfortunately a D4 offsides and the garbage overtime rules of the time robbed the Chiefs of a Super Bowl appearance. Another one is Peyton Manning's 2013 season when he threw for a record 5,477 yards and threw a record 55 passing touchdowns for a prolific Broncos offense that shattered the record books. The disastrous Super Bowl leaves a bad impression to what was an otherwise incredible season, but it's still in discussion for greatest quarterback season ever. But what if I said that 2013 Manning wasn't even Peyton's greatest season, and that it is a testament to how great Peyton Manning was, as great as any quarterback that has ever played the sport, that he has at least 2 seasons that belong in that discussion. This video is about his legendary 2004 season, perhaps the pinnacle of quarterback excellence. But first, like and sub, and check out my social media accounts. It is greatly appreciated. I love talking about sports, and I also have an interest in other areas that my other social media accounts cover or will cover. Anyway, onto the video. Peyton Manning is a football legend. Back in the 2000s and 2010s, Brady versus Manning was a very common debate. And while that isn't really debated nowadays, there's still a dozen of us out there.
There are dozens of us. Dozens!
That believe Peyton Manning was the dominant quarterback of his time. But this video isn't about that. It's about his excellent 2004 season. Heading into 2004, Peyton had played 6 full seasons and had career stat lines of about 25,000 yards, 167 touchdowns, and a passer rating of 88.1, which looks pretty bad today, but was great for the time, ranking 5th all time heading into the 2004 season. He was a 4-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time second-team All-Pro, and a 1-time MVP and first-team All-Pro after an excellent 2003 season where he shared MVP honors with Steve McNair. Up to this point, Manning was clearly on track to go down as one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever live. The numbers were great for the time, and when you exclude his rookie season, he had a career 91.5 passer rating up to this point. He was also not even 28. His best years, in theory, were still ahead, but even what we saw from his mid-20s was greatness. The problem for Peyton was that up to this point, he had 0 Super Bowl rings, 0 Super Bowl appearances, and had a 2-4 playoff record, as well as 2 missed postseasons. Peyton's misunderstood playoff career deserves his own in-depth video that I will one day make, but at this point, it was hard to defend Peyton's playoff woes. It especially did not help that all of a sudden, a 6th-round draft pick had just won 2 Super Bowls and was 6-0 in the playoffs, winning against Peyton's Colts in the 2003 AFC Championship game and going 4-0 overall against Peyton's Colts. We knew Peyton was an elite quarterback. We knew he was one of the most talented to ever play the sport way before he turned 30, but in terms of Super Bowls, he was being outclassed by a guy no one outside Michigan or New England even knew or cared about heading into the 2001 season. Still, I do think Peyton was overall very good in the 2003 postseason, but the conference championship performance against the Patriots, granted one of the best defenses ever by the way, left a bad taste in NFL fans' mouths heading into 2004. That game also had some questionable missed calls at the end that prompted the NFL to make some rule changes in the 2004 season that affected the passing game. And by that it meant making it even easier to pass the football. With that disastrous game and the recent rule changes in mind, Peyton had to do more, and that's exactly what he did. But first, he had to face off against the Patriots again. And he was good, very good, when you consider how dominant the 04 Patriots were on defense. But ultimately, the Colts lost in a hard-fought game where kicker Mike Vanderjagt missed a makeable field goal to give Brady a 5-0 lead against Peyton's Colts. But that was the low point for the regular season. A game where Peyton still threw for over 250 yards, 2 touchdowns, and still had a 93.5 passer rating against that defense. Statistically, that was his worst game where he played most of the game that season. The rest of the 2004 season, Manning was extremely efficient. In a 12-game stretch, Peyton threw for 3,663 yards, 44 touchdowns to 8 interceptions, and had a 128.7 passer rating. He also was only sacked 8 times in those 12 games. In a full 16-game season, those numbers are insane. In today's NFL, those numbers would also still look insane in 17 games. But for 2004 Peyton, this was merely 12 games. When you break down this 12-game stretch, it gets even more impressive. Against the Titans, Peyton had 250 yards and 2 touchdowns to 0 interceptions. His last passing touchdown coming at the first play of the fourth quarter. The Colts won 31-17. Then against the Packers, one of the best football games you will ever see. Seriously, just watch a highlight reel of it. Peyton was incredible, throwing 393 yards, 5 touchdowns to 0 interceptions and 0 sacks. He had a 140.9 passer rating, and his 5th touchdown came at the very end of the second quarter. The Colts up 35-17 at that point. What adds to that game's legend was Favre was also amazing in his own right and nearly orchestrated a comeback. But ultimately, the Colts won 45-31. The next game, Peyton regressed, throwing 220 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception to end up with a 99 passer rating. But it was enough to beat the Jaguars 24-17. Then the next game, a 35-14 victory against the Raiders, was another very good Manning performance where he had all of his passing touchdowns in the first half. This is a common theme for 2004 Peyton, and it adds to how legendary he was that year. The following game was against the Jaguars again. This time the Jaguars prevailed, but Manning was far from the reason the Colts lost as he threw 3 touchdowns to 0 interceptions and threw a touchdown that tied the game 17-17. But Josh Scobie made a 53-yard field goal with 38 seconds left that won the Jags the game. Moving on, the following game was another loss, 35-45 against a high-powered Chiefs offense. But Payne was great in this game, sans 1 interception. He also threw for 472 yards, threw 5 touchdowns, and had 0 sacks. But Trent Green also played great, and Priest Holmes played much better than Edgar and James, which was ultimately the difference. The Colts were now 4-3, but it's hard to blame Payton for any of them. He played about as well as you would expect against the defense that they saw, but the Colts defense was struggling to stop anyone. The next game was against the high-powered Vikings offense, and the game delivered as the Colts won 31-28 off a last-second field goal. Manning had a near-flawless game, and Edgar and James also had a huge game against probably the worst defense in the league. But against the recently created Texans, the Colts dominated 49-14. This was another game where Manning threw a ton of touchdowns, 5, and didn't throw any touchdowns in the 4th of this blowout. He did have 2 interceptions and a sack, but both interceptions came after the Colts took a 28-0 lead to start the 3rd, so the interceptions didn't hurt his team one bit. Which is even more proof that his impact was insane when 2 of his 10 interceptions that season didn't even hurt his team. Anyway, the next game was against the Bears and their stout defense, and it went the same as the Texans game. The Colts took a commanding 34-3 lead about halfway into the 3rd, and Payton didn't throw another passing touchdown the rest of the way as the Colts won 41-10. Payton had 4 touchdowns on 28 attempts, and his lone interception came after the Colts were up 27-3 to start the second half. Another interception that did hurt his team. Up to this point, the Colts were 7-3, and Peyton threw nearly 3,000 yards with 35 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. At least 3 of those interceptions didn't even hurt the Colts, and overall, it's hard to argue Peyton had a truly bad game. But arguably his best was to come against the Lions, as Peyton threw 6 touchdowns to 0 interceptions and threw all of them before the fourth quarter. Another game where Peyton did pass stats in the fourth. Sure, it was against a crappy Lions team, but it was a continuation of some of the best football we've ever seen. And it continued on against the Tennessee Titans, as the Colts won 51-24, with Manning throwing for 425 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. This one did have a rare fourth quarter passing touchdown to give the Colts a 48-24 lead early in the fourth, but overall, Peyton played pretty well. The 2 interceptions could have gotten ugly, and he also had a fumble loss that also contributed to this being very close for most of the game. But ultimately, if this is the worst Peyton played out of 4, a game where he still led his offense to 51 points, I'll take it. Just more proof that this was probably the greatest quarterback season ever. The following game against the Texans, Peyton had nearly 300 passing yards and 2 touchdowns to 0 interceptions. Just another great performance, and for whatever it's worth, both his touchdowns came in the first. Manning went back to having a normal looking stat line against the Baltimore Ravens, but considering how insane those 2000 Ravens defenses were, Ray Lewis was in his prime, and Ed Reed was the Defensive Player of the Year that season, Peyton still had a very impressive stat line of 249 yards, 1 touchdown, and 0 interceptions and sacks as the Colts won 20-10. The last full regular season game for Peyton was against a great Chargers team led by Drew Brees and LaDainian Tomlinson, who both were fantastic that year. This game was also notable for being the game where Peyton passed 1984 Dan Marino for most passing touchdowns in a season, tying Marino midway through the third and passing him near the end of regulation to tie the game. The Colts won in overtime, and Manning was as usual the driving force, throwing for 383 yards and 2 touchdowns. But he also had an interception, a very uncharacteristic 4 sacks, and 2 fumbles that he's lucky were recovered. Overall, he played well. It was against a 12-4 Chargers team that was solid on defense, but this was ultimately the end for 2004 Manning's regular season, as he only attempted 2 throws for 6 yards and what was essentially a rest game to close out the regular season. The fact that his 2004 averages are counted in a game that he barely played in only adds to how great it was. In 15 full games, Peyton had 4,551 passing yards, 49 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions for a passer rating of 121.4, a then record, and a record adjusted net yards per pass attempt of 9.78, which is still the record over 20 years later. He was also sacked only 13 times for 101 yards lost. As far as rushing and fumbles, he only had 38 rushing yards and 5 fumbles, but only one of those fumbles was lost. When adjusting to today's 17-game season, 04 Peyton in the games he tried threw at a rate of 5,158 yards, 56 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions. What an insane stat line. I mentioned earlier, but Peyton also had several games where he sat out or barely contributed in the fourth and even the third quarter, and at least 3 of his interceptions didn't even hurt his team in the grand scheme. One valid argument against 04 Peyton being the greatest quarterback season ever is that the 04 Colts had a pretty soft schedule, especially on defense. The Colts went against the NFC North, which was notoriously bad on defense that season, and no doubt contributed to the numbers that both Peyton and Dante Culpepper had. And that's fair, as well as the fact that it happened immediately after the rule changes, where it's not unusual for refs to overcompensate to correct past mistakes that contributed to the rule change even happening. But the reality is, with pretty much any historically dominant season, there is usually a perfect storm. For Peyton, the rule change and the soft NFC North schedule were the catalyst. Now, what about the playoffs? Well, Peyton started out great against a very good Broncos team, throwing for over 450 yards on only 33 attempts, 4 touchdowns to 1 interception, and only 1 sack. Only one of those touchdowns you could argue was not needed, but the other 3 were, as the Colts won 49-24. But then the Patriots game happened. This Patriots team might have been the greatest football team of the 21st century. They were loaded on both offense and defense, and I'm pretty sure they had an elite special teams unit as well. The Colts were loaded on offense and had the best quarterback in the league, but the defense and special teams were weak. The physical Patriots defensive backs were not affected by the 2004 rule changes, as they neutralized the Colts receivers, limiting a high-powered offense that averaged nearly 34 points per game in the regular season games that they tried, and 49 versus the Broncos, to just 3 points. To me, that's more a testament to how dominant the Patriots defense was. But Manning also could have played better. It is a valid criticism of his 2004 season, but his receivers also did him no favors against that Patriots defense. Speaking of which, Marvin Harrison Sr. always regressed in the playoffs, and Payne's playoff numbers were significantly better when he threw to anyone else. Some food for thought. But it wasn't just Marvin. Manning also threw to Reggie Wayne, who was a reliable receiver throughout his 14-year career, as well as Brandon Stokely, Dallas Clark, and Marcus Pollard. It was a strong receiving core, but not as dynamic or potent as the 07 Patriots, 11 Packers, 13 Broncos, or 18 Chiefs. When factoring all that in, 04 Peyton, in my eyes, had the greatest quarterback regular season ever, and the more you contextualize it, the more brilliant that season becomes. But what if I told you this wasn't Peyton's actual best season? It was statistically, but when you factor everything in, supporting cast, opponent's face, etc., there was one season where I believe he was truly as apex, and that video will come hopefully within a year or two. But what about you? Who do you believe had the greatest quarterback season ever? Let me know in the comments down below. Cyber out.